So we're now going to hear from the experts, and it's my pleasure to introduce Darren Miller, the CEO of ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency that supports companies and institutions that are building our future energy system. Accelerating hydrogen is one of their investment priorities, as I know, and we're lucky to hear firsthand from their CEO on their hydrogen plans. So thank you very much for joining us, Darren, and I will hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Christina. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you as well, Rob and Fiona, for joining me on the panel. I feel like the Minister's handballed me a lot of questions, so I've got 8 minutes to talk to you before we move on to Rob and Fiona, but hopefully there'll be some good questions and time afterwards. So I might just start by quickly introducing ARENA for those of you who don't know what we do. So we're a federal government agency that was established in 2012, and our goal is to increase the competitiveness and ultimately the supply of renewable energy technologies and renewable energy in Australia. We effectively have $2 billion of federal money to invest, and we've committed $1.6 billion of that to over 500 projects to date, spanning a whole variety of renewable energy technologies. We're probably best known for the work we've done in moving large-scale solar to commerciality. So over that time in 2013, 2014, we financed about 6 projects with $300 million of grant money. And as the industry moved to commerciality, we took a final step of providing about $92 million to get 12 projects up and running. So $300 million of money in the early days to get 6 projects going, and then $90 million to get 12 projects going. So that speaks to our role in driving technologies to a commercial outcome, to the point where now we don't get involved in large-scale solar projects anymore because they've reached commerciality. And I think anyone who's been following the industry over the last decade would see the incredible cost reductions in solar technology. Roughly about 10 times cost reduction from 10 years ago. So now solar is the cheapest form of renewable energy, bar none, on the planet, and we're very lucky to have got to that position. One of the reasons I'm talking so much about solar is it gives us a pointer to what we can achieve in hydrogen. 2 key things to bear in mind. For a renewable hydrogen industry, we need extremely cheap renewable energy input. And for the first time now with solar and wind, and huge amounts of land in Australia and skills in Australia, we have that opportunity to feed into the hydrogen production process very cheap, very abundant renewable energy. And the second thing that makes it interesting is that the hydrogen technology itself, the electrolyzers and the plant required to produce the hydrogen, could follow a similar cost reduction pathway to what we saw with large-scale solar. So what drove solar and wind to commerciality, and is doing the same for batteries, is a global commitment to do these things at scale. And when you choose to do them at scale, you learn quickly, you get costs out of the system, and you can produce cheaper equipment. And if you think about it, renewable hydrogen, once you've built the equipment and installed it, it costs zero. It's got a zero marginal cost of production, or very close to zero, because it's all very capital intensive up front. So if you're learning through the process of building capital equipment, you're essentially proving to yourself along the way that you've got renewable hydrogen at a very cheap price. An order of magnitude, we don't have as big a job to do in getting the costs down out of renewable hydrogen as we had with solar a decade ago. In a sense, solar's come down the curve by about 10 times. We probably only need hydrogen to come down the cost curve by 3 to 4 times to reach the target of $2 a kilogram that Minister Taylor talks about. So in rough terms, we could probably produce renewable hydrogen today at about $8 a kilogram, maybe 7. And if we're aiming for 2, we only need to get that down by 3 to 4 times from today. So we think it's eminently doable with a large amount of effort and money behind it, notwithstanding. But there's a huge amount of interest in the space right now. And it's illustrated by the presentation today. We've got 300 people, I understand, dialing in. And we did a roadshow around Australia as we were launching our renewable hydrogen deployment round. And we attracted record crowds, in my view, at each of the sessions throughout the states in Australia. And it just blew us away, the amount of interest in the hydrogen sector. So it clearly has caught the imagination of the Australian public, and certainly in the energy industry. People who've been in the space for a long time see a great opportunity for renewable hydrogen today. I think the one thing that we need to realize and why hydrogen is important from a lay point of view is that the very first thing we've done, and we've done it quite successfully, is get electricity to be renewable and at very low cost. So when people think of renewable energy, they're really thinking of renewable electricity generated by solar and wind. And as we've seen in the last 12 months, just on 21% of the national electricity markets, electricity came from renewable energy sources. Electricity is the easiest sector to turn into renewable energy, and we think we can get to very high shares of renewable energy in the electricity sector. But there's a whole bunch of the economy out there that can't electrify. So heavy industrial processes is a key example of where you cannot use electricity. We don't think we can easily use electricity to convert those processes to renewable energy. So we need to be looking for other methods, whether that's energy efficiency, process improvements, different innovations in that space, but particularly around fuels and also feedstocks. Feedstocks being the chemicals that go into the processes that generate the outputs. And hydrogen is that holy grail molecule that can both be an energy store and source for these industrial processes, as well as providing feedstock into processes such as green steel, which steel uses 7% of the world's emissions, or accounts for 7% of the world's emissions. And there's a pathway to substitute hydrogen into that process over time and essentially eliminate all the emissions from a heavy process like steel production. So that speaks to why it's so important. And as I've said to you, we have the key ingredients now that give us hope that this hydrogen industry can be built out over time. And we're putting a substantial amount of money to work in the space. We've invested over $50 million to date in ARENA over the past 2 to 3 years in a whole range of projects. We've committed another $70 million to this hydrogen deployment round, which the expression of interest stage closed last week. And again, we've been really encouraged by the response we've seen from industry. We've had over 30 really substantial applications for this renewable hydrogen round that we're putting forward. And we're hoping to build 2 to 3 industrial scale electrolyzer projects out of these 30 expressions of interest that we've seen. So again, we'll only touch the sides with this next phase of the industry, with the money that we're putting down. But certainly it's what's needed to start the journey of establishing what is the true cost of building hydrogen production facilities, and how do we then take that next step beyond this phase into what should be a multi-decadal journey to essentially green our gas networks, green our industrial processes, green our transport, heavy transport, using this technology. I'll leave it at that. I'm just on 8 minutes, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. And we all agree that ARENA plays a critical role in decarbonizing the economy and the environment. So we certainly hope that the funding will be extended beyond 2022. So yeah, we'll leave the questions for when all the panelists have finished their presentations, but you can all start typing on the Q&A. So now I would like to welcome Dr. Fiona Simon, the CEO of the Australian Hydrogen Council, which is the peak body for the hydrogen industry in Australia. Dr. Fiona, thank you very much for joining us.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Christina. I really appreciate the invitation, the ability to speak to everyone tonight, so thank you. So just got some very basic slides. If we could move to the next one, please. Great, thank you. So the Australian Hydrogen Council is the peak body for the hydrogen industry, and we've got members from across the value chain, and we connect the emerging hydrogen industry and its stakeholders to build, ideally, a secure, clean and resilient energy future based on hydrogen. So our key objective is to accelerate the commercialisation of new hydrogen and fuel cell technologies, and that's for transportation, export, storage and stationary applications. And we really see our key role as connecting the many players in this space. The hydrogen ecosystem is massive, and So we see ourselves having a key role in providing those connections and helping, you know, get the collaboration going that's so required. So we go to the next slide, please. So we started off as Hydrogen Mobility Australia, and that was in 2017 with founding members Toyota and Hyundai. But the membership's growing quickly. As we all know, hydrogen's become very much vogue, and we have members from across a number of different applications now. And late last year, we changed our name to the Australian Hydrogen Council, and that was to reflect the diversity of our membership, the broader hydrogen agenda. We now have 39 members. So if we move to the next slide, please. I'll spend a bit of time on this one because this is the why hydrogen story, and you've all heard versions of this. So why hydrogen? It's unique in many respects. And as the Minister certainly pointed out, first of all, it's storable and over time and transportable. And because hydrogen can exist as a gas or a liquid, it can be stored for long periods of time and, unlike batteries, not use its energy value. And that's where hydrogen can play a really important role in balancing the electricity grid. It can be transported over long distances, whether that's truck or ship or pipeline. And that helps our communities maintain access to energy when needed. And obviously, as a result, it's also able to be exported. And as we've heard, Australia has a good opportunity to export hydrogen to other countries. The second thing about hydrogen is that it's made and not found, so much like electricity. So you can make hydrogen in different ways, and we have experience in this already. So there are the fossil fuel and the green versions of hydrogen. And as we've heard, it's very much the green hydrogen pathway that presents the longer term opportunity for Australia. The basic technology in producing hydrogen isn't new, although there's always enhancements and new ways to produce hydrogen continue to be developed. And I've seen some of the Q&As come through it and talk about some of them already. So the man-made element of hydrogen can enhance the economic resilience of regions in Australia and Australia as a whole. Because with a vibrant hydrogen industry, we're not depending on limited resources either here or internationally. So this goes to the energy security discussion that was had before. So hydrogen production can support remote areas and maintain access to energy for a range of uses. And the third aspect that I think, when combined with the other two, makes hydrogen the absolutely unique energy carrier is that hydrogen is versatile, and then we can convert it for different uses across the energy transport sectors and the industrial processes. It connects these sectors and it creates efficiencies because it can be moved around for different purposes as needed. So electricity and hydrogen can together provide the backbone for future Australian energy production and use. And they can do this in a way that supports economic resilience. And I also do want to be clear, electricity and hydrogen are not alternatives. They need to go together. Hydrogen is created using electricity. It is the energy within the electricity that is being stored when we store hydrogen. So, the two together, so rather than a pure electrification path, hydrogen gives you those additional opportunities to store for longer periods of time, as I said, to export, and you're getting that diversification that helps, present that more resilient future. So, so far so good. Leads to the question, so why aren't we living in the hydrogen society already? And that's because hydrogen production, transport and consumption require infrastructure, as we've heard, to make it, to move it, to use it in a range of ways. And we don't have that infrastructure because we already have petrol, diesel, natural gas and coal to meet our energy needs. So there hasn't previously been a real incentive to look at hydrogen seriously, at least not in any long-term way. But we are at this new time, as has already been discussed. This is changing. So countries across the globe are looking to ban internal combustion engines. They're pricing carbon. They're setting ambitious green targets. And this means that the cost-benefit analysis of hydrogen is shifting relative to those incumbent forms of energy, because those incumbent forms are becoming increasingly untenable in the long term. And in that long term, hydrogen starts to become the obvious answer. It is the source of public benefit because it helps us transition to that inevitable new economy. And our export market potential in hydrogen is huge, and that's very much in the stated desires of countries like Japan and South Korea to actively shift to hydrogen that's clean and green hydrogen, and really potentially to import it from us. So if we move to the next slide, please. So the priorities that are here are the Australian Hydrogen Council's priorities, and we absolutely support the National Hydrogen Strategy, and we're working with all the relevant entities to see how industry can really provide a valuable input to policy mechanisms and really work collaboratively. What we need to do is get on with achieving that H2 under 2 target, so hydrogen under $2. And we do have significant government support through the National Hydrogen Strategy and the jurisdictional government strategies and plans. So we're part of that overall picture to try and coordinate the work across the country, and there's a lot of goodwill. And we're also working with others to map what getting to H2 under 2 looks like. So when do we think we can get there and what's involved? And there's still question marks about that. There's a relatively simple target still has multiple pathways, and it's about how can we make sense of how we get there. The one thing that's clear though is that we do need to establish the hydrogen market. We need to establish the demand to bring on the supply. The huge export market potential is one type of demand, and it's driven much of the interest to date. But we do need domestic demand, and that's, well, and there's different views on this, but there is arguments for domestic use full stop. And then there's other arguments that we need that in order to get to the export scale. And with the domestic demand, as we've heard, you get fuel cells, you can to drive cars, buses, trucks, ships and trains. There's talk of it in aviation, it might be a longer term. It's certainly talking about gradually replacing natural gas for heating and cooking, blending hydrogen into the natural gas network. We've heard about industrial and chemical processes, so green steel, and energy storage also to give us security of electricity supply. And all of these things are already happening, but at a smaller scale. So we need to get them to a greater scale to get this market up. And the more demand, the faster the supply can come through at commercial levels. And so to get the demand, we need policies to activate the market. So there's standards, goals, tax incentives, and other things that help level the playing ground and can help hydrogen compete against the incumbent energy sources and give those messages to investors. And we also do need further government funding in addition to what's been announced to date. This is a public infrastructure matter. It's about targeted funding in the public interest, and we absolutely 100% support ARENA continuing on in a form where it can continue the great work that's been done to this point. We will see the cost of production for hydrogen fall sharply. There's a number of reports with different statements, but hearing sort of 50% in the next 10 years. Hydrogen will become increasingly competitive with other low carbon energy alternatives. But we do need that government support, and then when you start to get that initial funding, it pulls through significant private sector investment. Just one last slide, please. Move to the next one. So before I finish up, I just wanted to quickly touch on lessons we've learned for our COVID-19 experience, which can apply to our development of renewable and clean energy like hydrogen. First of all, I want to point out we actually did a survey of our members, and the very positive news was that even when, for most of them, their businesses were quite heavily impacted by the economic downturn, and that's understandable. And most of these businesses are not themselves hydrogen businesses; they are businesses that are looking at hydrogen. Even though they've had significant disruption, the 80% of the members who responded to the survey still had 100% commitment to their hydrogen plans and were going ahead. So, that's very good. But anyway, in terms of the lessons we've learned, well, first of all, we've seen the drops in pollution across the globe. And so communities know what clean air looks and smells like. And obviously the effects of the pandemic on our economy, they've been catastrophic. And we do need to get industries back up. But in doing this now, we've got that clearer vision of the public benefit that we could be working toward as we manage the energy transition. And secondly, the pandemic and the recent fluctuations in oil prices have obviously shown that Australia needs to value energy diversity in the interests of economic security. And so local hydrogen production can provide high volumes of energy to industry, cities and homes across Australia. It can create local jobs. It can bring new design and manufacturing opportunities, particularly fuel cell technologies for automotive, aviation and marine. So anyway, to conclude, Australia is in a particularly advantageous position to get to H2 under 2 and to manage the challenges. We have the land mass, we have the solar penetration, we have the motivation, the technology, the market skills and the experiences across the organisations in the hydrogen ecosystem. And I certainly very much looking forward to seeing how everything unfolds. So thank you very much. That concludes my presentation for this evening.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And thank you for the work you do with the head of the Australian Hydrogen Council. So last but not least, it's my pleasure now to welcome Rob Grant. He's the Director of Energy at Fortescue Metals Group, and he'll be sharing with us how Fortescue is planning to build a global scale green hydrogen business that will help them become carbon neutral by 2050. Welcome, Rob.
Thanks, Christina. And thank you very much for the invitation to join everybody this evening on a very interesting discussion. So my role is to lead the full value chain of hydrogen production across the multiple elements we'll talk about shortly at Fortescue. And I've been in the role since April of this year, so relatively new. And prior to that, have had a long career in renewable energy and leading Australian companies in building global scale renewable energy businesses across Australia and Asia and Latin America. I'm going to share a presentation with you. Which has the usual disclaimer at the front end. I hope everybody can see that. And to talk a bit about Fortescue initially. So you'll all be aware that Fortescue Metals Group is an Australian iron ore startup, not dissimilar actually to the business I used to work for as an Australian startup renewable energy business back in the early 2000s. But it's gone on to become the third largest iron ore producer in Australia and the fourth largest in the world. And importantly, has done that from a blank sheet of paper. So our chairman has very high aspirations for what he can now achieve in the energy industry, particularly in hydrogen, because of the experience he's had from starting FMG back in 2003 and seen its success to date in taking advantage of Australia's, one of Australia's comparative advantages, which is producing iron ore, and looking to apply the same sort of philosophy to producing hydrogen, particularly through large-scale production of renewable energy. And to that extent, I've already now invested in a number of projects, which I'll talk a little bit more later on, and also set a very challenging carbon emission reduction target for the company, which feeds into our hydrogen story as well. So Fortescue has three very substantial hubs, or two substantial hubs currently under operation, and a third and a fourth under construction. And they've, like most iron ore operations in the Pilbara, either diesel generation or natural gas. And in the case of Fortescue, that's the case of both natural gas and diesel providing energy to Solomon hubs and the Chichester hubs. And the company, through its decision on becoming carbon neutral by 2050, has decided that it has to act very aggressively and quickly on both its stationary energy emissions from gas and from diesel, as well as from emissions from transportation. So the first stage in dealing with emissions from stationary energy has been to invest in the Pilbara Energy Connect project, that is to link up the existing mine sites and to substitute as much as possible the thermal generation of those mines with solar and battery. And the first stage of that was actually announced at the end of last year, and in conjunction with ARENA and partners at Alinta, using installing 60 megawatts of solar down at the Chichester hub, which will take out of service all of the diesel generation there, and will substitute it for gas-fired power overnight from Newman, and solar power from the new Alinta power station. We will then add to that directly from our own investment another 150 megawatts of solar farms close to the new Iron Bridge project, and at the connection of the new power system that's being constructed currently between Solomon Iron Bridge and Chichester. So look, coming from a renewable energy background, I can see how, you know, it's going to be a relatively straightforward process for us to, and we're actually calling it kind of business as usual, to decarbonise our electricity use. As much as we're seeing on the East Coast, you know, the conversion from thermal generation to renewables is a straightforward economic one. Obviously, we have to manage intermittency and storage, because at the moment there's, you know, we're not connected to the East Coast. So there is still the requirement for gas generation overnight, but that is obviously an opportunity for batteries as they become more economically viable, and other forms of storage around solar thermal, etc. But we'll be working on that as I say, as a business as usual. What's more challenging is our ability to reduce emissions from transportation, and obviously as a large producer of iron ore, we have many haul trucks running around the projects. We have a substantial rail network, tugs, and then ships, and they are all in, you know, all in our scope 1 and 2 emissions, and with a very substantial interest from shareholders of Fortescue and globally. You know, we've made this undertaking to ourselves and to the market that we'll be carbon neutral by 2050. That means we've got to take out those emissions from our transportation fleet, and that is likely to be impossible from electrification, given that battery vehicles will probably only be suited for passenger vehicles, but more challenging, as we've heard earlier on from the other panelists. So fuel cell vehicles for large trucks and trains and probably ships will be the way to go. And so we've decided that we have to have a hydrogen production business to enable us to take control of meeting that commitment of being carbon neutral by 2050. Given that we probably burn about or use about 600,000 litres of diesel a year, if we're going to be converting to hydrogen on that sort of scale, then we also believe, and given the location in which most of these iron ore mines are situated, we can as well take advantage of the location in a very significant solar resource to create hydrogen at a global scale and export it. And when we talk about exporting hydrogen, it's most likely to be in the form of ammonia, because it's a far more efficient way to transport to overseas markets. And again, that goes a bit to some of the questions I saw earlier on about you know, managing intermittency of renewable energy generation for hydrogen production. So just as a hydrogen 101, to produce hydrogen, it requires renewable energy that can be intermittent, but to then produce the ammonia, it requires 24/7 baseload energy. So that's a you know, point that we're also considering closely, as how to maintain that 24/7 production for ammonia production. But for creating our own hydrogen to decarbonise the transportation fleet, that's something that we're working. We see a pathway over the next couple of decades to be achievable. To do that, you know, we have to recognise that green hydrogen production is still a very early stage globally, and we need to get very rapid skills in-house about how to develop, deploy, operate, and then use the hydrogen from electrolyzers. And as Darren was saying, electrolyzer use around the world is a bit like solar was 10, 15 years ago. You know, they were relatively small and quite expensive. You know, through the transition over the next decades, we'll see the improvement in technology of electrolyzers, as well as the scale economies that come from mass manufacture of them, help reduce the cost of that component of hydrogen production. And bear in mind that, as the Minister was saying early on, about 60 or 70% of the cost of green hydrogen comes from the energy production. And so we've come a long way in being able to achieve, you know, very low cost power for green hydrogen production through the improvements in solar and wind over the last decade or two. What we still need to see is the cost reductions coming in electrolyzers. But our investment to date has been in a couple of 100 kilowatts for a Perth passenger vehicle car, Perth passenger car hydrogen refueling station. We are then moving to about a 1.5 megawatt electrolyser, which will be producing hydrogen to power a fleet of buses that we use on one of the projects in the Pilbara. We just submitted an application, one of the 30 applications to ARENA last week for a natural gas, for a hydrogen production that will blend with natural gas into some thermal generators. And this is really you know, us learning by doing, and to put into context, you know, 20 megawatt electrolyser will be by far the largest in Australia, and not far off the largest in the world. For us to be able to meet our own emission reduction targets, we're going to need to have hundreds of megawatts of electrolysers, and to become an exporter, we're going to need gigawatts of electrolysers, and that'll be powered by, you know, multiple gigawatts of solar production. And, you know, why is that possible for Australia? Because we've got all this space, we've got this amazing solar intensity and resource in and around many parts of Western Australia, and historically they have been demand constrained areas. But if you think about hydrogen now as the vector or the carrier of sunshine, we can now see us becoming great exporters of hydrogen in the same way that we've become great exporters of iron ore or of LNG. So that's a journey between now, you know, small now, but a reasonable pathway through to 2040, where we will have offset a large majority of our emissions internally, and hopefully become a very significant leader in the production and export of green hydrogen globally. We're doing that with the support of a number of the councils, including Fiona's, and coming at this as a collective is critical. And we're very excited to be working with a number of associations, particularly also up in Asia, who will be the major customers initially for the hydrogen production that they'll need to start substituting for diesel in some of their markets. So look, I think that's slightly over my 8 minutes, and I'll leave it there and look forward to answering questions. Just on mute, Chris.
Thank you very much, Rob. And it's really great to see that Fortescue is setting its net zero by 2050. We don't have a national net zero in Australia, but companies like Fortescue are moving forward with their own targets. So that's fantastic to hear. So I'm conscious of time again, and we would like for people to be able to ask as many questions as possible. So we'll kick off with the Q&A. One of the questions, assuming the energy industry is concerned at increasing amounts of domestic solar, is it possible to electrolyze water for hydrogen whilst there's high amounts of solar being generated and use that hydrogen in the boiler furnaces, or store it for later use in gas turbines? Is it safe for hydrogen to be mixed in a furnace or a gas turbine, as it's highly flammable and needs little energy to ignite it? Who wants to respond to that one?
I think we can all probably respond to it, but I think the answer to the question is, of course it is, and that's one of the longer term uses for hydrogen, is to essentially replace natural gas in gas turbines. So we've heard a lot about natural gas being a transition fuel, and the transition in our mind would be towards hydrogen one day. Once hydrogen can be produced cheaply enough, then you can have hydrogen flowing through the natural gas pipelines and being supplied to peaking plants to provide that balancing support that solar and wind energy need. Fiona, I know you have a more technical background than me, but perhaps you can answer the technical
No,
side.
I don't. No, I support what Darren said. I don't need to repeat it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, what is the replacement time for a hydrolyzer and cradle to grave cost for hydrogen production infrastructure?
I think we're on the beginning of that journey. I don't think anybody has a clear answer to that just yet. Darren?
Yeah, I think that's probably right, Rob. I mean, we would run the economics of an electrolyzer plant over, 15, 20, 25 years, depending on how long the finance almost stretched out. The key electrolyzer component being the stacks, which is where the hydrogen gets produced, would need to be replaced on a cycle basis. It depends how intense the usage of the electrolyzer is, but you could say between 5 and 10 years, you might want to replace the stacks of the electrolyzer, and that'll cost a percentage of the original capex. But these should be long-lasting pieces of industrial equipment, and they're heavy industrial equipment that'll just be maintained over the life of them.
Thank you. Is hydrogen technology for power generation already in commercial readiness, and is it competitive, or does it still need lots of R&D?
Well, look, it's unlikely. Well, the most likely use for green hydrogen initially will be in diesel replacement. So, the cost of importing diesel to Australia or into Asia makes green hydrogen more competitive than trying to use green hydrogen to burn in gas generators here in Australia, where gas is particularly on the west coast, $2 or $3 a gigajoule, and on the east coast, LNG parity is something more like $4 or $5 a gigajoule. So we'll see it first in diesel replacement, and then we'll start to see it in as we really get down the cost curve, as the minister said, towards $1 a kilogram in electricity generation.
Yeah, I think just to confirm some of the messages we've already heard is that yes, there are definitely new technologies coming to play with hydrogen, but most of it's not a sort of R&D matter in the sense of it being a new technology or a new way of doing things or safety questions and no one's ever thought of before. It's that cost curve question of what's cost efficient. How does hydrogen compete? And so we could have a question about every possible use, and is that currently possible, and is there R&D? And I think that same answer would apply to all of them. It's by and large, the question is actually more one of the infrastructure needing to be in place to create hydrogen at scale, so that production end, and then then specifics of targeted infrastructure for the use end.
Thanks, Fiona. Another technical question. As has been the case in the electrical grid and the renewable energy target, could we see a similar target for green hydrogen injection into the existing gas grid of 2%, for example, by 2025 or 10% by 2030?
That's the position of a gas blending target is very much one that we support, and that is held by our members in the gas networks. And that's part of that other piece that I was talking about before about creating the demand, having the demand come through. And I think that that's not so much about picking winners as people might think in other areas. There aren't that many ways of creating a green gas that would be available at scale like natural gas. There aren't that many ways to do that in a way which can be done at scale and in a clean way. So hydrogen to replace natural gas over time is actually the obvious answer, in which case there is a public benefit to there being targets put in place to then help drive that demand and help create the help create an improved commercial case for the businesses in that space.
Thanks, Fiona. But correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't hydrogen highly corrosive of the present? If we use the infrastructure we have for natural gas, we would have to upgrade that infrastructure in a way that if we blend more than 20% of hydrogen, it won't corrode the pipelines. Is that right?
It is absolutely correct that the materials used for the pipelines does need to change. It needs to be adjusted for higher concentrations of hydrogen, and that's where there is R&D work. That's where there's big programs of work. There's the Future Fuels CRC and others who are looking at the nature of the materials and the cost-effective ways to have them be fit for purpose. At this stage, the gas blending that we're talking about, though, is at the level where there is no need to change anything in the existing infrastructure, and there's certainly no effect at the customer end. It would be absolutely unnoticeable. It would be purely replacing 10% of that which has generated carbon emissions in the natural gas.
Thank you.
I think, Krista, to your point on that policy before and this journey to get the increase in the Australian economy, the parallels with the renewable energy target in Australia over the last 20 years has been a good example. And although it's been hotly contested, the renewable energy target has been highly successful in bringing down the cost of renewable energy to a level now where it's cheaper than thermal generation that we started off with 20 years ago. And we would hope that the same could apply here with green hydrogen, that we can have both a technology roadmap as well as some sort of destination that we're trying to get to. And that will deliver kind of certainty to investors and confidence also that for the non-stationary energy part of our emissions, that we're going to be able to give transportation some sort of target to work towards in terms of contributing to our Paris commitments.
Thanks, Rob. I think this is a question for Arina, for Darren. Has Arina started to look at hydrogen via pyrolysis of methane with 100% recovery of solid carbon? Might be cheaper means to do the same end.
So we would not be allowed to, under our legislation, to look at methane, for example. We're a renewable energy agency. Our input has to be renewable energy. Having said that, we are looking at a project with a company called Hazer in Western Australia, which is taking biomethane or biogas and using a catalyst, an iron catalyst actually, to produce hydrogen and carbon and a carbon byproduct. So we're certainly interested in all types of technologies that can produce renewable hydrogen, but ultimately the feedstock, the input has to be renewable, and methane, the vast majority of methane supplies are from fossil fuels today.
Thanks, Darren. Is there anyone pushing for domestic usage of hydrogen for domestic steel production, taking steel production home instead of exporting our coal and iron ore to China and re-importing steel?
Look, there is the potential for it, and clearly, if we are in producing global scale green hydrogen, then taking that and putting it into steel production processes should be entirely possible. At the moment, as was stated earlier, those gas and coal reforming inputs creates a very significant contribution to global emissions, but they're not in Australia. So look, we would like to think that, particularly if we start to look at Scope 3 emissions from the sector, that we can be contributing to the solution as well as reducing our own emissions from Scope 1 and 2.
Thanks, Rob. There's a question for Fiona. Has the council participated in the design of the hydrogen certification? And if yes, what is your role?
That's being led by the federal department and the team that's responsible for implementing the national hydrogen strategy. So it goes by different terms. There's the guarantee of origin scheme. That's how it was referred to in the national hydrogen strategy in one of the issues papers. It's also called certification, and it's one of the main priorities that came out of the NHS, and it's certainly one of the key priorities for our members. And just for those who are less familiar with the idea, it's particularly when we're talking about export partners, they're going to want to know what they're buying, and you can't tell when you look at hydrogen, what colour it is, how was it made. So there's a need to be able to demonstrate how the hydrogen was made, and that's when you hear about green hydrogen and blue hydrogen and brown hydrogen, and then there's other colours that other countries use as well. So having a means by which a purchaser of the hydrogen can know, well, what sort of energy was used to create this, and was it created from water or was it created from another source? That's vital, and it's vital to have it in a way that your international partners value, because if we come up with our own and no one really cares, well, then you still haven't given the customers what they want. So because it has such a major impact on the entire export market, it's reasonable that the government is very, very interested and is taking the lead. And AHC, yes, we are very much participating in the work that they are doing. We actually have 10 working groups ourselves under AHC, which are sort of paired up with the key aspects of the National Hydrogen Strategy. We have an export working group, which is very much focused on how we can contribute and help create the right certification scheme for Team Australia.
Thank you, Fiona. Which areas of the hydrogen supply chain are showing the most promise for achieving significant cost reductions?
Are we, in that case, yes, I'm not sure, we're talking about the supply chain itself or the different uses, because there are so many different ways of
the supply chain, I suppose, that's what the question is about.
Well, I don't know, actually, I might leave this one to Darren or Rob.
Yeah, I might have a crack at that. I mean, there's two key ingredients to producing hydrogen. One is renewable energy, and that is capital equipment in the form of wind and solar, which is at record low costs, but will continue to come down the cost curve continually as we scale up. The second is the electrolyzer, and that's the key component to now producing the hydrogen. So in terms of what's critical, in terms of the supply chain, it's being able to produce electrolyzers cheap enough, that are sufficiently mature and stable. And we're seeing a lot of activity from the likes of Siemens, who I see are in the chat today, answering questions and asking questions. And then there's a lot of Chinese producers of electrolyzers as well. And what's really intriguing is that, as Bloomberg New Energy Finance points out, the cost of the Chinese manufactured electrolyzers are already at the cost that we need them to be to achieve hydrogen at very low costs, close to the $2 that we've been talking about. So what's going to be really interesting over the next year or two is, as we see projects being built, is to understand what are the differences between the German and the European technology that is more established and these new up and coming Chinese electrolyzer technologies. And hopefully driving the cost of all of that down the same way that we saw solar panels driven down over the last 10 years.
Thanks, Darren. Now, with regards to the government, I suppose, is the current policy position of the government in the right place? And what would you like to see added?
Can I start with that one?
Yes.
I think we're enormously heartened by the interest, and we say the government, so the Australian government, but certainly all the jurisdictional governments as well, enormously heartened by the interest in hydrogen, and hearing what the minister was saying earlier tonight, it's really positive. What we are still very much in the early stages of doing, though, is mapping out, as I said earlier, what does H2 under 2 mean, and how ambitious is that? Well, it's only as ambitious as where you set the year. But if we set the year at 2030, well, then what does that actually mean compared to 2040, 2050? And I think what we need then to see is that ambition matched with the understanding and the recognition of what that then requires. If we were to say 2030, well then, and this is not just an industry sort of pitching for money, this is something which is, understood about the nature of where hydrogen is. It's about looking at other countries and saying, well, actually, there is significant investment required here. And that's where, for example, we look at ARENA and the value of ARENA, the value of CEFC. ARENA I'd point to particularly because they are at the funding stage. CEFC provides concessional finance. And so it's really where there is already an ability to have a commercial return. We are not there yet with hydrogen. And so what is required is that grant funding, and that's what ARENA does. And I, you know, having ARENA potentially look beyond renewables is something which a number of my members would like, and which we generally support. Recognising that there is a role for the fossil fuel versions of hydrogen to sort of act as a bridging mechanism, get us there to green hydrogen eventually. But yeah, there are many things that we would like to see in an ideal policy world that would be the things that would then match up with our ambition to have H2 under 2. And it's those market policy mechanisms, it's a carbon price, it's certainly supporting you know, things like the gas blending target, and it's continuing the life of ARENA in the way that best supports, you know, renewable technology, renewable energy.
Do you see that a net zero would help us if we had a stronger target? Would that actually send a message and make it clear that the hard to abate sectors will need to decarbonize?
I think all messages, and you know, compared to an absence of messages, are good. Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Fiona. Anyone else want to comment on what is their wish list for the government?
Well, you know, it's similar to the renewable energy story. A lot of the change is led by prosumers, consumers, and industry. And in this case, it will be much the same. Again, I think it's hydrogen is not as hotly contested, I don't think, as renewables were. But it would be good to have kind of an aspirational target, and that's certainly what industry is good at doing and business is good at doing, is setting aspirational targets which look hard to achieve, and then setting up plans and strategies and plans to get there. You know, we're dealing with Paris commitments. These are multi-political cycle and almost multi-generational to get to. So, you know, it is up to us as citizens, as much as you know, the political class, to come up with the solutions. And I don't think there's any harm in having you know, a national target in the same way that we're setting ourselves global target to keep temperatures below a certain level and emissions down to, you know, certain levels by 2050.
Thanks, Rob. Darren, do you have any comments on that one?
No, not specifically, Christine, other than to say that regardless of what the policy is or what the ambition is, the only solution we have to this problem is technology. So just echoing Minister Taylor's comments that we have to have a technology solution, and commend the work that the government's done on sort of laying out the options. We've got 140 technologies named in the technology roadmap, and really important that we start to narrow down, focus, and have some stretch targets and goals and plans to achieve impact in chosen technologies, and continue to learn and refresh our approach and attempt to lead the world in this. I think Australia has an enormously impressive opportunity. It's up to us to grab that by both hands. We've got land, we've got sun, wind, we've got intelligence, we've got capital. These are the ingredients to succeed in the new order.
Great. Okay, we have quite a few more. I'm wondering, probably have time only for 2 more questions. So let me just select what, a few of them are quite repetitive of what you've already replied. Okay, so somebody's just asked, Rob, I think it's back on one of your comments that you just made, but do you mean that there is no longer any need for subsidies for renewable energy generation?
Well, the renewable energy industry in Australia was supported by the renewable energy target, so we were required to generate 35 gigawatt hours of our electricity by 2020 from new renewables, and that was sort of agnostic as to which renewables were going to be the ones that were providing that. You know, as we got nearer that target and had significantly more scale in wind and in particularly solar, as those scale economies of manufacturing of solar panels really kicked in, you know, we met and beat that target quite significantly, and in the end did it at a cost lower than the wholesale price of electricity. So we didn't need in the end to draw on any of the the sort of the penalty mechanism that was contained in the renewable energy target. So initially the target was there, or the penalty was there to sort of top up the difference between coal-fired generation and renewables back in the beginning of the target. And by the end, renewables actually coming in undercutting coal-fired and gas-fired generation, particularly new coal-fired generation. So that's what I mean by not requiring subsidies. And the same would be the case with green hydrogen, that we're not trying to pick winners here. As Darren says, there are many technologies that can help us get to the solution. Setting a policy for using green hydrogen in the economy is really what we need, and then the market will sort out through the various ways that it wants to invest and which technologies come through first, how it achieves that.
Thanks, Rob. So we've discussed the cost of changing the infrastructure and upgrading it, and the cost of generating green hydrogen and all of that. So someone's asking, and I'll ask Fiona first, but can you identify then what's the biggest barrier for hydrogen to really hit the market?
Largely it's what we've already heard. So the biggest barrier is the fact that we don't have a market. So then you look at, well, how does one create a market? And it's about reducing that cost curve. It's about whether one says it's about starting with supply to bring down the cost of electrolyzers to then ultimately result in lower cost to produce, or whether you do more what we're doing with AHC, which is focus on the demand. The answer varies very much according to which belief system you operate under, also with types of hydrogen and as I said, which end of supply and demand to start at. I'd say that, I mean, the barrier is that we don't have a market. So it's, well, what does that mean? And I think I'd start with demand. It's a very difficult question, because I feel as though we've spent this last time answering exactly that question from a number of different viewpoints. So I think it's about ways of creating our market, whether it's the government funding, whether it's the policies to drive demand, whether it's targeted government funding along the lines of what ARENA's doing to bring down the cost of electrolyzers. It's all of those things working together to create this, to take it from a sort of a potential to a reality.
You're talking about a market for green hydrogen, because we already have a market for hydrogen, but 99% of the hydrogen derives from fossil fuels at the moment. Is that what you're talking about?
I think, well, yes, I think if I think about the market that we are all thinking about as being that this great future for hydrogen,
yeah.
I wasn't thinking about our existing environment. That's going to have to change too. That's, the path it will need to go down is by surely over time, regardless of which government is in place, we're going to need to see decarbonising of those industrial processes and the like for our existing market. But yeah, absolutely. When we talk about the market, certainly everyone I know, we are talking about that future, this potential that we've all been talking about.
But you do think that if we reach that delivered cost of $2 per kilo by 2030, there will be a market. The issue is the cost. And therefore, that's why the market is not there. Once we have a feasible cost for hydrogen, there will be a market. It's probably,
you need the market in order to get the cost down in the first place. So, it's far more fluid than that. If we have hydrogen at $2, it's because we already had everything put into place to then get it to that price. Now, yes, it can go lower. This is the usual type of evolution you would see of a market. As to where we go from being not a market to a market is, I don't know that we have a pure line to draw there, but right now we're not commercial. It needs to become commercial, and there's numbers of ways to get there, and there will be, and commerciality will also depend on the use.
Thank you. Darren, would you like to comment on that, or Rob?
That's right. I mean, the $2 number is comparing with sort of an alternative fossil fuel derive power generation output or kilometre driven in a diesel truck. It is, more likely to be that we'll be competitive with diesel replacement for large transport, sort of at $2 to $3, and more and likely to be below $2 to be competitive with gas-fired generation on the East Coast and probably lower on the West Coast. So there's not, but that's the aspirational number. And the point being, as Darren said before, is we've got to get a threefold reduction in the cost of hydrogen production in the coming decades to be able to decarbonize this part of the economy. So it happened in solar, and we will still, and it's still happening in solar, and that's why we're having the conversation. It's because renewable energy got to this point that we can have a conversation about green hydrogen. Electrolyzers have always existed, or have existed, and we can split oxygen and hydrogen from water. For some long period. It just was we didn't have the low cost of renewable energy production to be able to do that economically. So we're just on that journey. We're coming down. It was $10. It's now maybe 7 or 8. We need it to be 5 or 6 in the next 3 to 5 years, and we'll be down at 1, and by 2050, hopefully, we'll be displacing all the fossil fuels that we burn currently in diesel or natural gas in turbines.
Thank you.
I think if I have,
I'll just jump in and say a couple of things. One is the history of the energy industry and forecasting is that everyone's got it completely wrong over time. So we shouldn't trust anything anyone says, including what I say. But I think if we get things wrong, we've got things wrong on the conservative side. We've been too conservative as to what we can achieve. And once the world, or at least a material part of the world, chooses to go down a path, these things are quite quickly achievable. So I think the biggest barrier for hydrogen is that, do we have a forcing mechanism somewhere in the world that's going to get us on this journey? And if we do, and that could come from Australia, it could come from China, it could come from Europe. If we do, then we're going to go down this cost curve, I think, pretty rapidly. But what's needed is a good partnership between industry and government, because there's going to be concessional money needed, and industry and government are going to have to work together pretty collaboratively over at least a decade to get these things to commerciality, at which point government will step away and this will be a commercial outcome. So there's a bit of challenge and hope in that, I think, but I'm sure we can do it.
Yeah, Chris, I think just the point to say, to give you a sense that this is coming, is that many of the fossil fuel companies, the large multinational oil companies, are already on this journey as well, and they see their market being attacked by green hydrogen, and they're, rather than fighting against it, they're looking to collaborate. So I'm sure Darren's got some submissions in the EOI last week that are from some of the MNOCs. So I think that's probably different to what we saw with the renewable energy story, where electricity couldn't be exported. So there was very much from the utilities a pushback on letting others in. Whereas with the fossil fuel industry, I think they see the opportunity just to expand into a different product. And as the world moves to decarbonising, they obviously would be smart to do that, because continuing to burn what they currently produce is not very sensible, and being part of the green hydrogen story is. So I think we'll start, and we're seeing that already. So it gives me some sense that we're on the right part of, we are on a positive journey here.
Thank you. Fiona, you still want to say something?
No, I will very briefly. And it's when we're talking, one of the reasons why I've ummed and ahed a bit to what seems to be quite simple questions, and why the answers aren't simple, is that, yes, there's that forecasting aspect for sure. And it's also just about the sheer number of variables in play here, because hydrogen is across these different sectors in these different ways. We're doing things we haven't done before, in the sense of thinking about the economics of the situation. As I said, it's more the economics than it is about the technology itself. But it's also the complex engineering of it. So when you're looking at, how much is the cost of hydrogen, you're looking at, well, how did you produce it? Was it an electrolyzer or by some other means? Where did you get the water from? Where were you located? How much did it cost to transport the water to you? Or in fact, were you next to the water but you're transporting the electricity? What was your method of storage? Was it a salt cavern or was it something completely different? And there's the treatment of hydrogen. There's the degree to which you've compressed it. The costs involved are hugely variable according to all these different decisions that get taken. And it's all up for grabs at the moment. Everyone is finding the way to make the economics and the engineering fit together to make this thing work.
Thanks, Fiona. I think the important thing is that there's a focus on it, and we're being quite visionary, and we can see it coming from the Hydrogen Council, ARENA, the government, and corporates like Fortescue that focusing a lot on hydrogen. And so I think we'll get there. It's a bit like the journey of solar, getting that price down, and we finally got it down, and it's cheaper than producing energy via coal. So, but we do have to wrap up. I'm conscious of time. We've gone past what we allowed ourselves to go to. So I would like to thank you. Thanks to the panelists for sharing their knowledge with us and for being with us tonight. And also I'd like to say a special thank you to the Smart Energy Council because they helped us behind the scenes with the technicalities of the webinar. So thank you very much, Max. I'm feeling rather encouraged after tonight's presentation, and what I heard seems positive. So C4C will definitely continue to do our work, which is to convince the politicians to take more action decarbonizing the economy and the environment. And hydrogen seems to be a no-brainer, although there are so many complexities involved yet to, for us to achieve that magic number for the dollar per kilo to be able to create a market for it. But thanks to all of you also who participated. And once again, we will be delighted if you guys can join us at the next events. Our webinar with David Cameron, as I mentioned, on the 23rd of June, and also the launch of C4C in Victoria on the 1st July. So please, if you have questions that you're really keen to get answers from, send us an email. We have 2 emails, hello@coalitionforconservation.com.au or president@coalitionconservation.com.au. So we really hope that you enjoyed the event. So stay safe. We hope to see you soon. And thanks again to all of you who were here with us tonight. Thank you.